course of this year, we've learnt a lot from the Stoics. We've learnt a lot of philosophy and great practices, and we've learnt a lot about what is and isn't inside our control. Be it the Stoics or be it any other spiritual philosophy that we seek and we attempt to practice, we still find it very difficult. We fall off the wagon all the time. We don't keep up our meditations, and we don't often practice what we are preaching or really live according to the precepts that we're learning. Why is that the case? Well, unsurprisingly, the Stoics address that matter head on. So tonight we'll be looking at what the great Stoic teacher Epictetus tells us about this problem. Epictetus was the freed slave who was the philosophy teacher of the man who would become the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. So, from a freed slave to a Roman emperor, this is the puzzle that has puzzled them all. What do we do about the fact that somehow all that great philosophy and spirituality we learn often doesn't seem to sink in much deeper than the surface? I will be reading from Epictetus' discourses during the course of tonight's discussion, because really, when you read him, he seems to be speaking in modern language to our modern selves. There's no shirking or saying, oh, that's dusty old Roman stuff, because it alarmingly seems to know our world as well as we do. So Epictetus raises this issue, the issue of how is it that we struggle so hard to absorb and live by the philosophical and spiritual precepts that we seek. He reminds us of, to start, the most basic philosophy that underlies Stoicism. He says, where does the good lie? In choice. And where does the bad lie? In choice. And what about that which is neither good nor bad? In things that lie outside the sphere of choice. He says, anything that is good, we define it so. Anything that is bad, we define it so, in the things that we have power over. But outside our own realm, where we have no power, do we even have the ability to know what is good and what is bad? So that is his starting point, reminding us it's all about what's in our control, and only what's in our control. And if we concentrate on what's in our control, we will be able to identify what is good and what is bad. Outside of our control is a distraction. So he says, you know that kind of thing, but how is it that we don't practice that principle? We all know that we're only in charge of what is inside of our control, but we don't live very easily by these practices. For example, with your philosophical side and your spiritual teachings, when you are shown, or when you approach something that tests those, that tests your moral or your ethical or your spiritual precepts that you are living by, you look at that and you say, does this fit into my spiritual worldview? He says, so why do you only apply those things when you're looking at philosophical or spiritual matters? Why, when you're shown some money, for example, don't you respond the same way? Why, when you're shown some money, don't you say, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? We don't. We don't even think of that. We automatically accept it most of the time. We automatically seem to think it's a good thing. We're not applying what we've learned. So he tells us the problem often with our philosophical and spiritual searching is that what we learn from that, we apply back to that. Stoicism, perhaps more than many, was a philosophy and is a philosophy of practical daily life. In fact, as I've said before, the philosophers remind us that the purpose of philosophy is not to sit and extemporize and have lovely, fascinating conversations that are distanced from the real world. The point of philosophy and studying the great philosophers is in order to learn how to live better and living in the practical, everyday world. So, what we really need to do, he says, is practice. The reason why we're so bad at anything is that we fail to practice. Epictetus says to us, why are you surprised that you excel in things that you practice, like your creative thing? Maybe you play an instrument, or your work, which you do every single day. Maybe you're an excellent leader, an excellent bookkeeper, an excellent helper or assistant, or whatever it is you may be doing every day. You're really good at that. You're not surprised you're good at that because you do it every day. You know that. How is it that, he says, that then when it comes to our spiritual life, we feel like we're struggling? We struggle, my meditation is really difficult and I'm not going anywhere and it doesn't seem to do much for me. And we forget to notice that we don't practice our spiritual life as much or as efficiently or as automatically as we practice everything else. Practice makes us perfect at anything. And the way to achieve spiritual mastery or philosophical mastery is, of course, through practice. So Epictetus is saying, why is that so surprising? We know that about everything else. You need to practice. He takes that idea of practice and practicing our daily stuff a little bit further. He says, look at a famous speaker or a famous actor. Why do they still feel anxiety when they go on the stage? In the modern world, we interpret that as saying, well, if an actor still feels anxiety if he goes on the stage, it's because it's still a good actor, because he's never overly complacent or anything like that. I'm sure that's true. But what Epictetus tells us is that often the real reason that someone who appears on a stage feels anxiety is because of what they want from the audience. They want the audience to like what they do. They want the audience to praise what they do. In a nutshell, they're anxious as to whether they're going to get applause or boos, praise or criticism. So that goes further, and he says, when we train actors and people who appear on the stage, we generally train them in how to do their art and how to act. We don't really train them in how to deal with the audience. And if an actor or an orator is not trained in how to deal with an audience, he or she is going to spend their lives veering between that was fantastic and I'm great and I feel so relieved and so good and all puffed up with pride, says Epictetus, and feeling dejected and rejected and censured and criticized. And as we know, many performers lead difficult careers because of that constant struggle against what might be the result of what I do. And Epictetus says the problem there is that we are not trained to deal with those results. So it's an interesting comparison that he makes, and definitely, if we're honest about it, one that is true. If you're some kind of performer, as I am here appearing before an audience, we have to admit that our anxiety is primarily based on the audience's response, much more than on the quality of our own performance. So Epictetus, of course, not surprisingly, has more to say about all of this. Epictetus, in his discourses, says as follows: we all experience things of this kind, whether we orators or not. What do we admire? External things. What do we make the prime object of our concern? External things. like the audience in the example that I just gave you. And then he says, but then we're unable to grasp how it is that we fall prey to fear or fall prey to anxiety. Well, what else could possibly come about when we regard things that bear down on us as being bad? The censure from the audience, the failure to respond, we see that as bad. And so naturally we're going to respond with fear and anxiety. He says, under the circumstances, we can't fail to be afraid because we're constantly in the anxiety of how is the audience going to respond, or how is anything going to respond, or what is the result going to be. So then we feel fear and anxiety, and then we say, oh dear Lord, set me free from anxiety. How can I be free from anxiety? Or we go to the psychiatrist or to someone else, to some practice or other that we'll often pay for to break free from anxiety. Epictetus is not shy. He calls us fools in that situation. On the subject of people who ask God, he says, didn't God give you the endurance or the greatness of soul or anything like that that you would need in order to endure? People are so concerned with the results of their actions that they don't concern themselves with the actions themselves. To simplify it, of course, if the actor is more concerned with her performance and concentrates only on her performance and concentrates on being the best performer possible, then she is concentrating on what is inside her control. And that she has great power of. And if that's the only thing that matters to an actor, or to anyone else for that matters, then she's going to get great joy from her profession. But if it keeps on mattering how the audience responds, then she's going to be veering between joy and despair and calling on God and the psychiatrist to deal with the anxiety. He's essentially saying, we are the source of our own anxiety. We are the ones that generate it. It's similar to, well, going further, and this is still Epictetus, something we find so familiar. When things work out very well, he says, we congratulate ourselves and we point out how much hard work it does require to get that far, and we're very good at all of that. But when things don't work out well, we blame fate and we wonder why, and we think what went wrong, and we reach out to the externals. Famously, we hold ourselves responsible when things work out very well. When things don't work out very well, we mysteriously fail to hold ourselves responsible and seemingly want to hold everyone and everything else responsible. Worst case scenario, we even rush off, he says, to the temple. We sleep in the temple and we consult the diviners and astrologers saying, what went wrong? And the astrologers and the diviners reach out, the astrologers, I am one. The astrologers reach out and say it was that planet that caused the problem, and it was that bad vibe or other that caused the problem. Failing to say, you're the problem, you caused the problem. Either you failed to rehearse and practice, which is the usual reason why things go wrong, or else you don't have the skill, or you literally just made a mistake. Even when it comes to astrologers and diviners, part of the job of an astrologer today, and certainly it's very likely that this really was the case for the last few thousand years, since astrology is so centered around the individual, it really is about taking responsible for who you are and what you are. As much as it might seem like people are saying that planet did this to me, astrology has always seen the planets as a reflection of our own human life, not really as a cause of it. And in fact, history tells us that the Stoics were quite comfortable with astrology when many other philosophical schools weren't. But I digress. This isn't about astrology. It's about any way in which we might reach out beyond ourselves in order to not be responsible for when things go wrong. So, as Epictetus describes it, a lot of the issue, a lot of the problem with ourselves is based on fear. We blame outside of ourselves because we fear what is outside of ourselves, and because we fear seeing ourselves or being seen in any kind of negative light. Fear seems to dominate us. Again, a profound wisdom that we today understand perhaps more than many people once did, that the greatest thing we have to fear is fear itself, to quote the old, now cliched saying. But it remains true that fear is in many ways the great enemy and the great paralyzer of ourselves that we fear. So Epictetus goes on to talk about that in his discourses, and he says, why are we still surprised that if we're engrossed with material things, we become mean, disgraceful, worthless, cowardly, and listless in our actions, and turn out to be complete failures? Because we've never paid any attention to those matters, and we don't take trouble over them, those matters of dealing with our fears and things that go wrong. If it hadn't been death or being banished that we're afraid of, and rather had been afraid of fear itself, we would have trained ourselves not to fall into those states of mind that seem bad to us. But as we stand, we concentrate on what's glib and fun and feels good, and as a result of that, we actually never get to understand and deal with fear is the great enemy. It's interesting because I'm sure many of us thinking about this as I talk and as we listen to the wisdom of Epictetus, many of us think that yes, indeed, we know that. We do. We've heard that before. We've heard it in other contexts other than philosophy, fearing fear itself. And he uses exactly those words himself 2,000 years ago, saying, if only we had been trained to fear fear. So we know that he must be true, because we ourselves say the greatest thing to fear is fear itself. And he then says, well, if that's the case, and if we know that, why are we not trained to deal with that fear? Instead of being trained only to do glorious things, we need to be trained to deal with the fear in some way. And the training, according to Epictetus, is practice. He says that it's because of our lack of practice that we pile up our difficulties and our fears and the problems in our lives. And we end up imagining that they are much worse than they really are. He says they're obviously not as bad as they are, because if we were practiced in dealing with them and that problem, we wouldn't experience them as so overpowering. We wouldn't experience them as some external thing that I have no control over. What really weighs down on us and what makes us lose our minds, he says, is our own judgment of things. We judge poorly. He says we are relieved by distractions. So he compares it to a crying child. And he says, if you give a crying child a sweet, then they'll stop crying and then they're fine. And basically, we are exactly the same. When we feel fear and anxiety, instead of practicing dealing with it, we distract ourselves with nice things and good things, which are sweets. And not only do they do nothing, but they're kind of bad for our health. So he says that we should, if we want to experience the good, instead of this anxiety or fear or whatever it is that I might be feeling, then we should get that from true judgments, where we've judged something to be good for us, not from something that is a simple reward that makes us feel nice or feel good in some way. So what are true judgments? What are true judgments? How do we know what is good or bad? Epictetus says true judgments are those that you really spend time and thought on, those that we reflect on all day, so that without any attachment to someone or something that is outside of ourselves, we can keep on applying the most basic rules. The most basic rules are based on that simple principle of Stoicism that I started off by reminding us of. The principle that says everything under your control is the only thing that you should be concerned with. You are under your control. How you respond to things is under your control. What you think about things and how you judge them as good or bad for you is under your control. And if you spend a lot of time contemplating that and thinking about what is in my control and what do I have the power of judgment over, we'll dramatically minimize the impact and experience of those things that cause distress and anxiety and fear. So Epictetus says, in pursuit of that rule then, preserve what is yours. Don't lay claim to what isn't yours. Concentrate on what you have. Don't concentrate on what you don't have. And very importantly, let go. Let go when something is lost or taken. Be joyful for the time you had it, but let go when it's taken. Again, it sounds a little bit like a modern philosophy. You know, we talk about letting go quite frequently in modern times, but of course it's an ancient philosophy, because Stoicism clearly points out that those things which we do not have power over, the only option is to let go. Enjoy the time you had it and just let go. Live in the present. You don't have it anymore. It's a very important Stoic principle that's often applied to death and dealing with death, and we will explain that further. We'll deal with that in another episode as well. So we think we are losing something. The issue of letting go is that we think that we're losing something because we're so used to what we are attached to that it distorts our judgment. We think that a person is ours. That's my friend, my partner, my whatever, my. And so we think that someone is ours, so then when they leave or go, whatever, we feel despair. And we think that a thing is our own, when a thing actually has limited value and will break or get lost or get stolen or something like that. It's a thing, but we became so attached to it that we experience grief when we lose it, as if it really was part of ourselves. We have poor judgment because of our tendency to attachment. We keep on yearning for things when we don't appreciate what we do have. It's like we sit here longing for the beauty of Venice when we're living in Cape Town, one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Why don't we concentrate on our appreciation of that? He's not saying don't travel, but he's saying look at your motives and look at your yearnings, and look when your yearnings stretch you to things that actually you already have or that are simply not yours to have. Don't feel pain and grief over what isn't even yours in the first place. He even uses that to address death itself. As I was saying, and that our crying and our fear is because we no longer have someone, and we don't concentrate on what we do have and what we did get and on the joy that we did feel and what is under our control. Those things which are not under your control, let go of them. That's how you let go of the grief as well. In closing, let's see Epictetus' closing words on this topic. This is what he says. If you wish for anything else than what you have, you'll end up following with groans and laments whatever is stronger than you are, because you'll always be seeking your happiness in things outside of yourself, without ever being able to find it. For you're looking for happiness where it is not to be found, and are failing to search for it where it actually lies. Because when things are under your control and you concentrate on those, you'll be happy. Look for happiness where it's easiest to find, right under your nose. It never ceases to be amazing and delightful as to how modern the Stoics really were and how little we humans have really changed. So we've got so much we can learn from the past. All the shenanigans happening in the world and in the cabinet, etc., as usual, it means next week is time for the month ahead. Join me there.